Was there any like actual documentary mixed in there?
It's a good question. It's hard to tell.
It really is.
Yeah.
There was no what?
No documentary footage.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Was it like recreations of documentary footage at all, or just like strictly like was it like based on like news reportings? Yeah.
Probably some news, but I don't know if there's any video footage that they saw.
Yeah, I don't think it was real video footage at all, but I mean, obviously it looked so real. They made a very dedicated effort to.
I knew they filmed it in like black and white, like we were talking about it, but I was just wondering if like they sometimes like slipped in some actual footage, like because I mean they had at the end they had that guy like filming like they would have been filming.
Right. That's the trick.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. That's why it's so unique.
Yeah.
Is it true, what they showed?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's history.
Exactly true.
Yeah. I mean, who knows if it's exactly, but you
Yeah.
know, did they draw the scheme for the terrorist organization that way, or did they make that up out of thin air? I don't, who really knows what that bulletin board looked like.
Did the French policy on torture change after this information came out about, what they were using?
I don't honestly know, but something, I mean, I have a few comments I was going to have in my notes, but we hosted a guy last year, James Olson, who was former head of the CIA's counterintelligence division, and he unequivocally said that torture works. Without a doubt, torture works. And there's debate about whether or not torture works, but here's someone who ought to know, just saying it works.
Yeah.
So you can break someone to the point where they give you false information, then you break them to the second point, and they're broken. So, what's the policy? What I'm asking is, what's the policy versus what's the reality?
Right.
And if you hold that belief and you're in a position of power, you're going to be doing bad things to people.
Right.
And I think, the film is so powerful, I think it raises a macro question, is what is worth dying for, right? So at the end, you're sort of hopeful for people. They're dying for freedom. And that's kind of noble. But on the other hand, look at the blood of the innocents on both sides. So, as human beings living in an awkward, difficult planet, what's worth dying for? And what's worth torturing for? No matter what side you're on. And people get swept into these things. And it's really odd to think about, because we just saw death right up front. It's very powerful to me.
And each side just seemed to escalate. The more one did, the more the other did. It got worse and worse. What struck me, this film made 45 years ago, how much it reminded me of the present. The terrorism and the counterterrorism. And, we have drones now instead of setting bombs, but as we fight terrorism, we commit terrorism. And you think of all the civilians that the drones have killed in Afghanistan, and all the civilians that the Taliban have killed there. And it just keeps escalating. And then my thought also was, here the Americans made contact with the Taliban, were trying to reach some kind of possibly peace accord, and of course it was all scuttled because of the government in Kabul.
I mean, it's important to recognize that what you're looking at is a political contest for power in many of these situations, and that's why people shed blood or shed other people's blood. They're looking for power, and so it's competing factions. And the odd thing, you can think the Algerian fighters are noble in some way, but what's Algeria? Right? They're fighting for self-determination, but for what group? What's an Algerian? It's a colonial border. So they have some self-identity after a while, but is that, at what point do people stop fighting for what arbitrary border?
When were Americans Americans? When did they start fighting as Americans?
I don't know.
It's about imperialism. It's basically about imperialism. We're all here because we overthrew the British.
Thanks to the French.
Right.
Right.
Wow.
Let's not forget our history.
I wonder who is somewhere talking about who are we, why did we have the right to do this to the great British, and what kind of acts of terrorism, Christmas addicts and the others perpetrated it such in our realizing ourselves and our sovereignty.
Yeah. No, it's a valid point, which is of course controversial, but what's the Boston Tea Party but a kind of terrorist act?
Exactly.
And So then the question is, what is worth dying for or not? And is self-determination, are they heroes? Are they villains? Are there, peaceful demonstrations? Was Martin Luther King alive back then to lead Americans to their independence? Mahatma Gandhi? These are very difficult questions. And so again, I come back to what's worth fighting and dying for? And when do you start feeling like an American versus a Brit, a colonial, self-determination? Around what political group is it worth fighting and dying for? I don't know. You had a thought, Julia? I thought I saw your hand move.
I'm thinking it over.
Yeah, you have
I mean, I think the Boston Tea Party is probably a little bit different than like a terrorist act in which someone dies. Like if you're deliberately taking human life, innocent human life, or torturing innocent human life, that's a little bit different than throwing tea.
Right. I mean, Tea Party might be a sort of extreme example, but the whole fight around. If you've been to Boston, you can follow the route of the rebels as they hide and duck and take pot shots at the British soldiers. And the point is, we were willing to attack what some people view as legitimate authority to break away from that authority. And if you were the Brits, you'd say, war of terror or whatever you'd want to say. You could say that.
Well, was there any negotiation between the Algerian people and the French government to change the regime?
A great question. And this raises another macro point, is as a revolution is beginning, and you can think about the Arab Spring right now, if you're any of those governments that are under threat, you don't know who you're facing, who to negotiate with, the size of the threat, so you basically face a couple of choices, which is to kill lots of people and hope to nip it, or make concessions. But how do you make concessions when you don't know who to concede to? You don't know how strong they are, so you don't know how many people to kill. You don't know if attacking and killing people will deter people or incite them, right? So these things take place with great uncertainty.
And that's why the Liberation Front really tried to be the voice of the people, so they'd be the body that the French would negotiate with. And that's why they were so intent on having this strike, the popular strike, to gain legitimacy in the international community.
Right,
and you see how the United Nations responded. They said they didn't want to take a side there.
Well, who's on the permanent 5 of the Security Council?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right.
So, and they were also trying to do the anti-wino campaign, the anti-prostitute campaign.
Yes.
So to provide good governance as a substitute. It was a, very interesting political message. And certainly you see, Khomeini came to power promising more purity.
Exactly, cleaning up.
Right.
And accusing, of course, the French for the degradation of the people.
Yeah.
Does this film represent a clash of civilizations? I was interested in its representation of just that. Like, what's motivating the FLN really? Are they nationalists, like Algerian nationalists, or are they driven by something else? I wondered how, I was trying to determine, as I watched the film, how is Pontecorvo shading that question? And it only became sort of national when the general strike came to view, and they had to make that effort. So what was, in the executive leadership of the FLN, what was the main motive? Was it just, anti-imperial or something else?
Anti-imperial.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that. And with shadings, people have different ideologies. It's certainly not a clash of civilizations. It was the death knell of colonialism. There's many feudal wars, but the futility of this war was it was after colonialism had passed. The French were fighting the tide of history.
Yeah.
So it was a war for independence primarily, with ordering principles secondary in importance. And the ordering principles happened to be somewhat Islamic in their nature, but I think it was independence. And, they're one of the last colonized powers. The heck with that.
Well, I would agree. People love their freedom. That's the way it is.
Yeah.
That's what the movie shows. I'm interested, though, in how people perceive the movie. Did you perceive it as being balanced in its approach, or taking one side over another? And how would it do it, if it did take a side? Yeah.
It seemed to be fairly honest in its depiction of both sides. You could see the violence and the terrorist acts on either side, and at different points in the film, you sympathize with different groups. And as an audience member, that tells me that they did a good job of depicting both sides, honestly.
So you sort of go, from one point of view to another. And
Yeah.
sympathize with it. Okay.
A lot of that
It's
seems
fun.
to have been done with close-ups, of
Yeah.
the victim in the cafes
Right.
at the end.
The close-ups, we were talking about close-ups today. I hope
Yeah.
you notice the effect of the close-ups,
Yeah.
right? Where you really see the emotion of these
Yeah.
people, and it really humanizes them. We're just talking about close-ups today.
Well, I don't agree. I don't think it humanized the French. The French were mostly military people that you saw.
Yeah.
They didn't have names. They didn't have homes. They were either wealthy people in consumer culture, in a cafe or a bar, dancing or having fun. They were well-dressed people going to parties. They weren't mothers and children at home like the Algerians were. I think the French were demonized in this film.
If you look at the dead of different, attacks by the French and by the Algerians, which they show bodies of children. Did you notice which children they were showing?
They only showed the Algerian children.
Right. That tells you a lot.
Yeah.
And then at the end, there's this interesting image of a baby held by his mother and crying as though he understood what was going on, he or she. And that for me, there's a statement in that picture. Movies really can make very strong statements. But it's true, at times you do waver. The civilians, how are they portrayed? All right, you said they were dancing and, these...
Leisure.
But Ali Lapointe, the first time we meet him, and he's running in the street, and he runs into a group of French civilians, and they're not portrayed in any sympathetic way. And then also the French civilians on the balconies who are, using this poor old man as a kind of, black sheep.
Scapegoat.
And then the bomb is put close to where he lives, right? His address is given to the police, and then they decide they're going to bomb the place and create an incident to get the Algerians into reaction mode so that they can repress them further. It seems to me, I agree with Julia that the French are pretty much demonized.
But they're still humanized, too, because I felt going back and forth.
Yeah.
I think it's complex, that both things are going on at once. And there was a boy in the ice cream shop.
Yeah.
They did pan in on him.
You don't see his dead body.
Yeah.
See, I think, those are little details. They're really important to me because they showed dead bodies of French people, but not children.
Right.
Yeah.
Even though the child is going to die, you don't see the body. Seeing the body really makes a statement. It creates an impression. We're talking about how directors can manipulate audiences also, so it's good to think about it.
Yeah.
Of course, it's an Italo-Algerian production, filmed in Algiers after the independence.
Yeah.
It's
Also,
not- yeah, if the French had done a movie, they wouldn't have done it.
I mean,
like
just
this, of
like
course.
Julia. I mean, they just they developed the characters on the Algerian side a lot more than on the French side. Like, the colonel had a little bit of development, but that was about it.
That's true.
And all the other people, you kind of got an insight into their views. Like Ali, he doesn't want to strike because he doesn't want to put down his arms. And all these other things, you kind of get an idea of what really motivates them. And the colonel, it's more just like a static person to just put down the rebellion.
Yeah. There are probably definite class elements that you're kind of highlighting there, because you see the schools of the Arabs, you see the markets, you see kind of day-to-day life, and then everything's leisure, and
Yes.
it's the leisure class when
other
it's the
side.
French. So it is definitely a classist movie in that way.
The Casbah is like a prison, actually.
Well, yeah, there's the architecture too.
Yeah.
And the French have the port, so they have the ocean and they're free. And the Arabs are stuck up there on the hill.
Yeah. Yes, the French took the best part of the city right in the 19th century, as you're going to read when you read Fromentin next week. I have two classes. We're gonna, it's all related.
So to make it a
Speaking
more
of,
francophilic film, though,
uh-huh.
what would it have, what would it have done?
Well, some mixed race friendships or marriages, some children that love it there and have friends among other little children, some integration, just some efforts to negotiate among business people maybe or something.
It's possible, I don't know, but it's possible living standards actually went up under colonial rule. Education might have gone up, or language.
We heard that during the
I don't.
Peace of Islam conference. There were
Very strong views.
very strong views
Yeah.
of what the French presence was like.
Yeah, and actually, it's not true that all the children were at the school were educated. Some were, but a lot weren't. I was thinking about the colonel, what he said about the leader of the FLN that they captured, and how he respected, and then this man committed suicide in prison. But he talked about respecting him, and I think that the colonel earns a little bit of that respect in the movie. We end up respecting him because he's a man of the army, and he's a hero. He's battled during the Second World War. So I think the movie does respect him as a military man who's doing what he thinks is his duty to keep the country.
Did I understand that this movie was banned in France
Yes.
until the last decade?
Right.
And if that was true, it would seem that they would think they weren't depicted too well.
Yeah.
Yes. They were horrified, actually, that it won the Gold Lion at the Festival of Venice.
I'm sure lots of French
Oh, yeah.
intellectuals were delighted.
Mm-hmm.
People like Sartre,
Yes.
Camus.
It speaks a bit to your original question about where's the status of torture in France. I don't know what the legal situation is, but the fact that it was suppressed shows you they're not coming to terms with their own past when it comes to torture. And the point about close-ups makes me think of the phrase, 1 million deaths is a statistic and 1 death is a tragedy.
Right.
And so the close-ups serve that purpose of humanizing tragedy. And it's always important to think when you see war statistics, which is I study a lot, to think there's a face behind every death, and there's
And
many
a whole
tragedies.
story, a whole
Yeah.
family, yeah.
So, and I'll,
Do either of you know, did the French defeat in Indochina have anything to do with the way they viewed this war in Algeria?
It seems that the experience, the background of the colonel in Indochina sort of directed the way he was going to go about quelling this, suppressing the revolt. That's what I got, but I can't tell you more about him in particular. I'm not into military studies. So. I have a question, though, about the depiction of women and the role of women, the Algerian women especially, in the War of Liberation, how they went and put bombs, and actually a lot of women fought very hard to gain their independence, and after the independence of Algeria, they were sent back to their homes and kitchens, and so actually a lot of what they hoped for, like I think with the French Revolution, right, didn't happen. So it was very difficult for them after all those hopes. But how are they treated in the movie?
Sort of like tools. They treat them well when they're doing their job, but as you said, when everything's done, they're not going to keep that status. And it sort of reminded me of how during the civil rights movement, or before it, I guess, right before it, that African Americans would go and fight for America and then come back and be treated the same way, and sort of like what happened to the women there.
I think they're given more than that in this film, because at the very end, she's the one that's kind of like leading the way to independence. They seem to me very modern. the fighters, the beautiful women, the ones that posed the bombs. I thought they were other heroines. That's my opinion.
That was an extraordinary scene when they were putting on makeup, cutting their hair.
Yes.
While they're...
And she knew she was going to die. She stayed there. You know, she had a lot of strength of character, that one at the end.
Yeah.
So.
The drumming was very interesting during that scene.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very primal. You could sense the violence coming. It was a very interesting choice.
You probably haven't seen The Orphans of the Storm recently.
No.
I just showed that in my class on the French Revolution. It's a 1921 film by D.W. Griffith, and there's the drumming when the mob comes to invade the Bastille. So similar scenes of crowds running through small streets. I wonder if this was a wink toward that in terms of a revolution film.
Yeah.
The man who scored the film is Ennio Morricone. Of course, we know that he scored spaghetti westerns.
Exactly.
And there was some of that music, some of that guitar twang, at disturbing, moments. And I guess now, in retrospect, it seems a little incongruous to hear that and know the associations of that, the other associations of that sound. But how did the score work for you? Did you feel like the film was using music in a way that's made you recognize other films using it, or did it seem strange at some moments?
It definitely felt like, they were trying to draw emotion out, Like we were just watching a film the other day, Fear and Trembling, and it was like a pre-romantic style of music where it was very mundane and just like repetitive. It had a lot of repetition and everything.
It's Bach.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Bach. And
What film is that?
Fear and Trembling.
one of the complaints was that it didn't draw out emotion like most movies usually do with their music, and this one definitely did.
I don't even remember the music in this. Was there a lot of music?
In this
It was-
movie? Oh, yeah.
There were, a lot of it did enhance the emotion, but I remember a few scenes where the music was in contrast with what was going on, or the feel of the music was in contrast. I think there was maybe one of the first two scenes, this sort of joyful, upbeat 50s, 60s music going on when they were showing I think it was the French military, like, about to go and invade one of the homes. And then in another part, when they play the dance music when they're torturing the man. But that was obviously intentional.
There's the score that draws the most emotion is repeated at the times of tragedy, and it's the same score that's used for the French and for the Algerians. That's really interesting, use of music. And you only notice that if you really, try to pay attention to see the film 2 or 3 times and start seeing how the music is used in different contexts.
I've heard that its use of music has now set a pattern for films like this. The battle scenes, ever since this film, have aped the same sort of approach, musical approach. Didn't it?
I thought it was also effective the way they used the reporters, sending their reports back to their news agencies to sort of fill in the background of what was going on. Sort of like a chorus. This is what's happening, and then they go on with the actual drama.
Wow, that's great. Like a chorus, that function of the chorus, which is to give us information.
Yeah, and to show how ignorant people were back in France, too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because the reporters don't know what's going on either. And that's something that comes up in revolution studies, is just how no one knows what's going on. Nobody knows. And it's not until afterwards that people try to make sense out of it all, but it's all, each one's biased in a different way. Because nobody knows what's going on.
Today we mentioned in class review a movie of 2006 on the Algerians who fought in the First World War, the Second World War, Indigène, the movie Indigène. And that movie, when it came out in 2006, finally helped people realize how much self-sacrifice there was among the North Africans during the French wars, fighting for the French. But even that was repressed, and they weren't getting their benefits. And so it really sparked a prise de conscience, how do you say that, an awareness. And the government changed its laws so that people now who fought in those wars are getting more benefits. But it takes a long time, very long time.
It's a great example of using the arts for
Exactly.
activism.
Right.
Because I think we're all going to walk out of this going, wow, and knowing a lot more than we did when we walked in.
Okay, but we have a French person among us. Can you tell us honestly how you react to this movie? I think it would be really interesting to have your point of view.
Yes. I think the movie is really good to show the two parts are not, too bad or too innocent. They are victims and people killed in the two opposite parts. For me, I don't really know the history of Algeria, and that was really clear and very simple to understand.
The film was very clear and simple to
Yes.
understand. And you were raised without any education on Algeria,
No, just
almost.
not in high school, just in university, because I take a course very specific on this subject.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Well, but how much do you know about Vietnam?
Right.
And how long did it take us to get to understand what we did to the Native Americans?
And they educate us so thoroughly on the Holocaust, and
Yeah.
because we were heroes in that situation, but in other situations they don't talk about it.
Very
And
hard to
that's
look
why you should be a minor in European studies.
Or a French major, better yet.
at. French major.
Another film that was suppressed was Paths of Glory, which was about World War I. So that terrible memory goes back further, and it was suppressed even longer, I think, from what their comments were. And that was about class, too, because that was about soldiers being sent to their deaths by upper-class people and not taking their lives into account that much, and a system of justice which was perverted by the upper class. Again, so lots of class in that movie. It makes me think, it doesn't make a great case, but the two movies make you think, well, the French anarchs are very sensitive, and, because it is a very classist society, and that's their elite schools that perpetuate their eliteness, and makes me think there's probably some sensitivity there to those issues. Because Paths of Glory wasn't that sensitive, really, you think about it. It's World War I.
For those of you who have studied the history of this, how accurate do you think the film was in portraying it?
I think quite accurate. Yeah. And the impression of the documentary is heightened by the fact that they have the dates,
Yeah.
the hour, the minute, all of that comes from archival records.
Oh, okay.
And torture. I mean, look at waterboarding.
Yeah.
They were doing
That's what I was
waterboarding
thinking.
right there.
Yeah.
This is a 1966 movie. We think waterboarding is somewhat newer one.
Yeah.
Or ancient.
Yeah.
Oh, and in the beginning when they used the guillotine
Oh,
to
yeah.
execute that guy, I was like,
Yeah.
they still use that, like, in the 60s?
Yeah, they did, but
That was
now
surprising.
France has abolished the death
Yeah, I know they
penalty.
have.
Yeah,
Oh, I
but at the time, no, they had it.
And I wonder if the guy really committed suicide.
Yeah,
I think that was
I thought
murky.
It was pretty clear that he didn't.
Yeah, I
Is that
didn't
Yeah,
right?
that's what I
Yeah.
thought too.
They let the reporter really have it.
Yeah.
Really have it. There were no CGI effects in this film. It's 1966. I was astonished just as a practical matter how you get thousands of people into the streets, because there were a good 1,000 people in some of those shots with tanks rolling up.
Yeah, and it was on location too, not like D.W.
On
Griffith in
location,
Hollywood.
yeah.
And the explosions too.
How many were professional actors?
Just
Approximately
Just
zero.
one. The French
Yeah.
colonel.
Really?
The one who
amazing.
performed,
Yeah.
yes, all the
The
rest
Ali
were-
Lapointe was
Yeah.
really good.
Yes, he was, but he was not an actor.
And has he become an actor since?
Pontecorvo went looking for faces. Yeah, that's what really mattered to him. He wanted
That's
to have
a school in
dramatic
French, or
faces.
in film. Bresson did the same thing.
Mhm.
The Trial of Joan of Arc and other films. Pickpocket. These are not famous actors. They're not actors. They're just people that have the
Yeah.
right look.
Exactly.
In some scenes, you could see people smiling in the background. That was a
Yeah.
little funny.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I love the scene of the tank disappearing into the background, becoming irrelevant. You know, that was my interpretation of that. The people were still there, and the tank was just rolling off into history.
But for the Algerians, when they made this movie, it was, very exciting for them to participate
Yeah.
in a historic movie about their liberation. Not
sure.
even 10 years later.
Did she have a point to say?
Yeah.
I was wondering, because you said in class today that like the only actual actor was the general. The little boy who died in the hole with everybody else, did he speak the language? Because sometimes it didn't seem like his lips were moving correctly.
Oh,
Like,
really?
I wondered a couple times watching him whether or not, like, they just found the kid and, oh no, he doesn't speak the right language. Just make it up. But I really couldn't tell.
I'll
so.
have to look at that. Look at that.
I
Wow.
noticed that kind
Yeah,
of
it
throughout
just-
the movie that a lot
Yeah.
of people, though, that their
Yeah.
voices weren't matching there.
He was the one that I noticed the
Yeah.
most, though.
And he's a very
1960s
interesting
film.
character, too. When you
Yeah.
think about the genre of the Revolution film, I mean, think of Les Miserables,
Oh, yeah.
Gavroche.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
on the barricades right into the last minute. He has ideals, too, because he
Mhm.
could have left,
Yeah.
but he didn't. He stuck with them. That's, I think, a really interesting motif and thought about what age do you have the right or the...
Make that decision.
And they showed the children beating up that man in
Yeah,
the
that was,
beginning.
Oh, yes.
that was troubling, very
Yeah.
troubling.
The cruelty and the
Yeah,
mass
of the
effect
children.
of the children. It starts really early.
But it's also the crowd psychology.
Yeah, exactly.
We've been reading Leah's, what's his last name's Canetti, Crowds and Power. Do you know that one, Dan? Elias Canetti, I think. He's an Italian sociologist. But powerful book for psychology majors to learn about the psychology of crowds, because, we can stand and speak on our ideals of humanity, but when we get into a large group of people in a crowded space, people act differently, and you lose your individuality oftentimes and just go with the mob.
That happened tons of times in the film, from the
Yeah.
balcony to the French people
Yeah.
beating up Ali Pointe. Just a repeated theme.
And on both sides.
Yeah.
But Ali Lapointe had a responsibility here in not shoving Omar out, not forcing him out. Because
Well, he
I
could have.
think-
It
Yeah.
might have been considered better to force him out since he was a child. He had a longer life ahead of him. And the question of at what age are you old enough to make that decision?
Because I felt like Omar wasn't really totally free. How free are we to make decisions anyhow? There's so much manipulation, but I felt like he was overpowered by Ali Lapointe, and that he felt it wouldn't be proper to leave him. And so he, gave his life.
So why did the French bash down the wall?
Yeah, really.
Yeah,
They
I
might have
think-
feared a bomb on the other side, but still,
Yeah.
if they had an ounce of humanity for the boy, which they said that they did,
They should have.
they could have bashed the wall down.
Yeah.
And
I mean, they don't know if they have guns behind there.
Well, they did have guns.
yeah, but the
So-
French have guns and twice as many people.
There's a lot more French stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, what French guy is going to be like, oh, I'm going to break down that wall
The one who takes
for a
orders
boy that
Private.
doesn't want to come out under his own power?
That's true.
Private.
Well, if you're interested in this realist approach, I mean, the Italian neo-realists in the 50s, French, Browning Cinema is going to show on Sunday, Rome, Open City by Roberto Rossellini. It's one of the films that started Italian neo-realism, which then affected European cinema in general. Perhaps Pontecorvo as well. It's a great example of this, and Bicycle Thieves is going to be shown, the Vittorio De Sica film is going to be shown a little later. So you can get your fill of non-professional actors and some gritty street drama
That's great.
And talking about future movies, at the end of the month, there'll be the movie of Gods and Men, which is a French movie, and it's about Benedictine monks in Algeria in the late 90s. And it's a film that had huge success in France. Did you see it?
Yes.
Yes. And the French they loved it, but it's a French movie. And then it shows the tragedy from the French point of view, in a way. So it's sort of interesting to put these two movies, side by side and compare the reactions of the audiences. Because it's also about the French in Algeria. And it raises very troubling questions. Were they, did they have legitimacy in being there? And what was their role, and why did they stay? And they became victims. So it's fascinating to think about history. And there's, 50 years between the two? Not even 40 years. Between 57 and 97, approximately. And still there's this French connection.
Yeah, all the questions about whether that stuff in here actually happened or if it's just artistic license or things like that. I mean, that could go back to 200 years where the records aren't nearly as much, reporting isn't nearly.
Yeah.
I mean, just makes you really think, what is the truth? I mean, it's really something we'll probably never really know unless you're there.
Well, that's a pretty good ending statement. We've heard about future movies, and now we don't know what the truth is. So,
Well, in some respects, I mean,
well,
you can still find out plenty of other truths.
but even us seeing the movie together, we have different interpretations on how the French were portrayed and so forth and so on.
Well, I'd just like to recommend that people read the newspaper.
Oh, yeah.
Especially the younger generation here.
Yeah.
If you want to have some truth, read the paper on a regular basis and not just the Observer.
Right.
That would be good.
Right.
A lot of people
and
don't, and it would be good to do that.
watch, the media too much, or just exclusively to other forms of reporting.
Journalism is important
Yeah.
because it's deep, better than just TV.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Great discussion.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Interesting.